I am announcing that the Justice Department will ask a federal court in Texas to subject the state of Texas to a pre-clearance regime similar to the one required by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This request to bail in the state of Texas and to require it to obtain pre-approval from either the department or a federal court before implementing future voting changes is available under the Voting Rights Act when intentional voting discrimination is found.
Okay. That provision that he's talking about that will allow the state of Texas to be bailed into the pre-clearance requirement is Section 3 of the Voting Rights Act. Same great voter protection ability as Section 5, but much harder to enforce. Remember, Section 5 automatically requires states with a history of racial discrimination to get permission from the federal government before they can make any changes in their voting laws. But by striking down Section 4, which determined which states were subject to that requirement, the Supreme Court essentially banished Section 5 to legal limbo for the time being. So the Justice Department is using the next best thing. Section 3. Section 3 also has a pre-clearance requirement, but instead of being applied to states already predetermined by a formula, Section 3 allows states to be bailed in or brought in under the umbrella of the VRA's, that's the Voting Rights Act's, protection. Here's the catch. Section 3 requires the federal government to wade into that rhetorical Bermuda Triangle and prove discriminatory intent, that a jurisdiction passed a law with the explicit intention to discriminate based on race. Telling a state that their voting laws are kind of racist is tricky because, well, let me return to Jay Smooth one more time.
It feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, I think you're is racist. When you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of.
So here's what that sounds like in the fight over voting rights. Voter advocate. Hey, your voter ID law is going to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of people of color. That's racist. Vote suppressors? That's not racist. That's a defense against voter fraud. See how that works? So while Section 3 can be an effective tool in the fight for voter protection, it is an imperfect solution. Fortunately, there is also a potential easy fix. Let's swap out intent for another 6-letter I word, impact. Making this small change to Section 3 would make a big difference in the government's ability to enforce the VRA. Instead of the requirement to prove the unprovable, shifting the standard of proof to disparate impact would give the Justice Department something observable, measurable, and quantifiable on which to build a case. Unfortunately, making that change also requires something almost as difficult these days as proving intent, getting the U.S. Congress to act. Joining me now is Alton Pollard, Dean of Howard University School of Divinity and Professor of Religion and Culture at Howard University. Richard Kim, Executive Editor of TheNation.com. Rebecca Cinderbrand, who is Deputy White House Editor at Politico. And Dale Ho, Director of ACLU's Voting Rights Project. And joining us from Austin, Texas, Ari Berman, contributing writer of The Nation magazine and author of Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. Dale, I want to start with you. If the Supreme Court has told us under Section 4, history is no longer the basis, if it is awfully hard to prove intent, then what can we imagine disparate impact as a way to get to voter protection?
I think we absolutely can because, focusing on intent, as you pointed out, really focuses on the wrong question. If I'm the victim of discrimination, it doesn't really matter to me why I've been discriminated against, only that I've been discriminated against. So North Carolina, their voter suppression law, it's going to disproportionately affect African Americans. If I'm one of those African American voters, it doesn't matter to me if the legislature did that because they don't like black people or because they think that black people are going to vote for a particular party. Either way, I've lost the most precious right that I have in our democracy. So focusing on intent, I think, focuses more on the culpability of the offender and evinces more of a concern for the offender's state of mind than what's actually happened to the victim.
Right. It also requires us, Ari, it feels like to me, it requires us to have the kind of rhetorical smoking gun that basically we have to turn all state legislators into Paula Deen in order for us to be able to say we need to, we need to protect voting rights. Talk to me about what you think is the possibility of either getting Congress to move towards impact or else being able to convince the Supreme Court that a disparate impact standard is a new way to rewrite that Section 4.
Well, hi, Melissa. Good morning. So most lawmakers are smart enough to say we're not going to discriminate against someone before they do so. Texas lawmakers weren't one of them because there is a long series of emails in this redistricting case basically showing how Texas lawmakers would carve up specific districts to subvert the growing Hispanic minority voting power in that state. So the federal courts were able to show in this case that the Texas redistricting plans were enacted with discriminatory purpose. But remember, they also blocked Texas's voter ID law without having to show that. If they had to show, for example, that Texas's voter ID law was enacted with discriminatory purpose, they might not have been able to block it. And that was the genius of Section 5. But I just want to go back quickly. There's an important historical example, which is in 1980, there was a very important case called Mobile versus Bolden in 1980, where the Supreme Court said that you had to show discriminatory intent to prove a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, another very important provision that applies nationwide. John Roberts, when he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, fought very hard to preserve the fact that Section 2 had to be intent-based. Congress in 1982 overruled the Supreme Court, overruled Roberts, and said Section 2 just needs to be impact-based. You'd only have to prove discriminatory impact, not intent. That preserved Section 2 as one of the pillars of the Voting Rights Act, which survives today. Congress can do the same thing right now with Section 3. It's not a very difficult change. They could do it tomorrow if they wanted, and there's a historical precedent for them to do so.
All right, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And Dale, I want to come back to you on this because right now, in front of the Supreme Court, with the potential of being heard, is the Mount Holly case. And the Mount Holly case is actually a fair housing case. It's not a voting case, but it does hinge on this question of disparate impact and whether or not disparate racial impact is a fair basis. And if this makes it to the court of John Roberts, who in the 1980s, as a young Justice Department attorney, was vigorously against an impact standard and wanted instead of an intent standard, are we looking at the possibility of even that Mount Holly could actually take down the voting rights possibility of disparate impact as a formula?
Well, I certainly hope that that isn't what happens, right? If we had a court that was respectful of our civil rights precedents, I wouldn't be concerned about this at all. But Shelby County, I think, dashes those hopes to a certain extent. I think, if the Mount Holly case goes up, I think we should be optimistic about its results because the Fair Housing Act has been interpreted to have a disparate impact standard for decades. It would be really a radical change to interpret.
But I laugh because I think, but radical change in the protection of civil rights is sort of what they're up to here.
That's unfortunately, I think, our worst fears as civil rights advocates, right? There's a possibility that case might settle. The parties requested additional time for briefing this summer to pursue those sort of settlement conversations. But I think the Mount Holly case really underscores why disparate impact is so important. In this case, right, you had an African-American community. Their neighborhood was demolished. The new development, most of the members of that community can't afford to move into. And again, it doesn't really matter to them why you did it. They don't have homes anymore.
Right. And so it doesn't matter if you were holding in your heart this negative feeling, which, and again, as we said in the case of Juror B29, that can be really tough, even in what feels to so many people like a clear-cut instance, right? Unless you can prove that this is what is in the mind of the shooter, right? In fact, you may have folks walking free, and so we may be at this point shooting down our voting rights. Stick with us. We are staying on exactly this topic. I'm bringing everybody else back in as soon as we're back.
These days, it seems like everyone's headed to the same old places to do the same old stuff. We say, it's time to change it up. It's time to put your blinker on and head someplace new, wherever that may be. The all-new 2014 Mitsubishi Outlander with advanced safety technologies, 31 miles per gallon and room for 7. It's never been easier to find your own lane.
It gives you a tremendous sense of pride to own your own business.
We sell ourselves. We sell our name. We sell our image. We want that image to stick.
I'm always introducing myself. I'm always handing out cards.
Vistaprint allows business owners to more effectively and affordably promote their business.
The fact that we use Vistaprint to put our name out in the community in everything that we do just goes to show the level of confidence that we have in Vistaprint.
The easy-to-use tools and templates at Vistaprint.com make it simple to look professional and coordinate your marketing across everything from business cards to websites to postcards and more. See how easy with 250 of our most popular cards. Now new, improved, and still only $10.
250 cards, you can leave a lot of impressions with that.
I have about 20 to 50 business cards on me at any time.
Visit Vistaprint.com, and as an introductory offer, we'll cover the shipping for free.
I'm not sure there is much else you can do for $10 from a marketing standpoint.
Vistaprint.com.
With my little girl, every food is finger food, so I can't afford to have germy surfaces. But after one day's use, dishcloths can redeposit millions of germs. So ditch your dishcloth and switch to a fresh sheet of new Bounty Duratowel. Look, a fresh sheet of Bounty Duratowel leaves this surface cleaner than a germy dishcloth, as this black light reveals. It's durable, cloth-like, and it's 3 times cleaner. So ditch your dishcloth and switch to new Bounty Duratowel, the durable, cloth-like picker-upper.
I've asked you to fix things that should never have been fixed.
My father's coming. What are you doing here, man?
You set me up 20 years.
You deserve worse.
Just want my family back.
No, you don't. You want my family.
Ray Donovan. New series, Sundays at 10, only on Showtime. At Showtime at half price. Call today.
Have you or a loved one experienced complications from a pelvic mesh or sling implant? Thousands of women are silently suffering with pain, infection, erosion, urinary incontinence, the need for multiple surgeries, or even the loss of an intimate relationship. Lee Murphy has female case specialists available to speak with you now for a free consultation. I'm attorney Erin Murphy. Don't suffer in silence anymore. Let your voice be heard.
Call 866-888-2910, 866-888-2910.
Passionate, progressive, weekends. Disrupt with Karen Finney at 4, followed by The Ed Show at 5, every Saturday and Sunday on MSNBC.
This is the department's first action to protect voting rights following the Shelby County decision, but it will not be our last. Even as Congress considers updates to the Voting Rights Act in light of the court's ruling, we plan, in the meantime, to fully utilize the law's remaining sections to ensure that the voting rights of all American citizens are protected.
That was Attorney General Eric Holder addressing the National Urban League's annual conference on Thursday. Richard.
So, my understanding about that intent bar, right, is that it's easier to prove that in the redistricting cases, right? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dale and Ari, is it because, on that level, the sort of quantum level of, decision-making there is race. They're using it as a proxy for partisanship, right? When you get to the ballot box issues, right, which have completely disproportionate racial impact, the intent there is not really race per se. It's just partisanship, right? And it actually affects young people, new voters, as well as African-Americans and Latinos, right? So, the question, there is the racial impact that we should consider, but I also think there's just a democracy issue with the ballot box issue, right?
Right.
And that should concern all Americans.
So I mean, I guess there's 2 pieces on that. I mean, one, also the other thing that happens in the redistricting, right? We know that this sort of the trail of emails, right, that Ari was just talking about. There's going to be an email trail. I was thinking maybe this is the first time progressives will be down with the NSA, like reading your emails, right? If we have to be able to prove intent in order to get these voting rights cases. But let me ask you about that, Ari, because it does seem to be part of what happens is you have to have these conversations across parties when you're doing the redistricting. It is a lot of back and forth and balancing. But, for example, seeing what we've seen in North Carolina recently, when there's a party in charge, it doesn't feel like you get that same trail of conversation when you're talking about these kind of voter ID questions.
No, and that's the thing. That's what makes it so important to have to be able to show impact, not just intent, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to prove these intent things. And I want to talk about Texas, where I am right now, because some people were saying, well, why is Holder suing Texas like this was some theoretical exercise? We had federal courts finding that 2 huge laws in Texas, the redistricting changes and the voter ID laws, were discriminatory last year. So there's already a record record of discrimination shown. And look at the voter ID case, because I think people forget here. You have 600 to 800,000 registered voters, according to the state of Texas, who don't have that ID. You have a handgun permit being able to use to vote, but not a student ID.
Right.
You have Hispanic voters 46 to 120% more likely to not have that ID. You have a so-called free ID, which you need an underlying document to get, which costs $22 as the cheapest option for a birth certificate.
Poll tax.
Which is why Eric Holder called it a poll tax, and why the federal courts said any law that makes you choose between your paycheck and your franchise disenfranchises you. And the last thing I'll say is Texas only has DMV offices in 81 of 254 counties in the state. So if you don't have that ID, which 600 to 800,000 registered voters don't have, and you don't have a car, and by the way, Hispanics in Texas are more likely to not have a car and to live in counties without DMV offices, how are you supposed to get that ID? You're going to drive 250 miles to get it? So for all those reasons, it was blocked under Section 5, and that's why the Justice Department and groups going forward are going to try to challenge this law in federal court under other provisions of the Voting Rights Act.
So Rebecca, I want to ask you about the politics, though, of what happens and what Ari's saying there, right? So he can lay out for us very clearly how these policies have disparate impact. But in order for this Attorney General, under this president, to sort of move forward with this, they are going to have to talk about intent. And that leaves an African-American president and an African-American attorney general having to say the state lawmakers in Texas are basically racist in their policy making. How bad is that politically, or how difficult is that for them politically?
Well, I mean, like, speaking about Texas very specifically, obviously for politicians in Texas, it's a great dynamic. There is no downside to them to be seen to be standing up to President Obama and the Eric Holder's Justice Department. You know, I want to circle back quickly to what you were talking about with the changes in Congress. I mean, the fact is we have two competing impulses here, right? We have somewhat the same dynamic we have on immigration, where Congress wants to be seen as moving forward on voting rights legislation the same way they want to be seen as moving forward on immigration, but they don't actually want to move forward on it. They just want to be seen as moving forward on it. And so you have, from the very beginning of this, the president's second term, you've had a process set up where they say, look, we know Congress isn't going to act. We have to figure out workarounds. And what you're seeing here is the ultimate workaround, the same way you saw on climate change. You're seeing the workaround begin.
And when they did DACA because they couldn't get DREAM through. I want to ask you, Alton, because it seems to me that part of what we're seeing, what we're going to see with civil rights groups and others, is that there's going to have to be a level of activism now around this that wasn't necessary when you had the Section 5 pre-clearance, right? That sort of opted people in. So now you're going to have folks on the ground bringing the cases, identifying it. You train, part of what you do is to train largely African-American clergy, and that has been a group key to turning out minority voters.
Yes.
Do they see the political work as part of their spiritual calling? Do you hear them talking about this as part of what they will be doing?
I think it's safe to say that they're indistinguishable for our students. We recognize public policy, political action, social justice, the life of faith all go hand in hand. There is no school of ministry preparation for us without that understanding. So our students are taking courses that are doing public policy. They're doing prophetic ministry. We are engaged in research around issues of gentrification, healthcare, education, economic development, a whole host of issues, so that they understand that it is not enough to simply be in a church. It is not enough to be with four walls and a steeple. That in fact the ministry of the 21st century is about what it has always been, being with and for and by the people.
You know, I so appreciate that, because as soon as we come back, we're going to talk about the person who I think is just absolutely the embodiment of exactly that, and that's Reverend Barber down in North Carolina, who, you know, is a man of the cloth, but is clearly a man of the people on this question of pushing back against the absolute madness in North Carolina.
Mortgage rates are near 60-year lows, yet millions of homeowners are still paying way more than they need to every month. If you'd like to lower your monthly mortgage payment, call Shore Mortgage today. We have over 1,200 team members standing by to help you refinance and lower your monthly payment. We've been doing it for 27 years, and we can do it for you in as little as 14 days. Call us now for a rate as low as 3.5% APR. Shore Mortgage, 800-860-2500.
Plugging in electronics in tight spaces makes you twist and shout. Then when you push furniture in, bulky cables keep pushing it out. Not anymore. Power it up with the side socket, the swiveling multi-plug miracle that allows you to move cords and furniture flush against the wall. It's never been easier to plug in, pivot, and power up 6 different components, turning this tangled disaster into a space-saving master. Side socket's unique swiveling action creates extra space where you need it most, and it's perfect when reaching behind tight spaces. So go ahead, push back couches, chairs, tables, and more to make every room bigger than before. Finally move kitchen appliances against the wall, instantly increasing counter space. Messy power strips clutter up the floor. They're always in your way. But Side Socket lifts cables up, keeping floors clean and clear. Equipped with optional anti-surge protection, Side Socket can protect all your expensive electronics during unexpected jolts. And the sturdy construction can take virtually any punishment your family can dish out. Oh no, smashing electrical cords is dangerous, but Side Socket swivels, redirecting power so you can safely slide all your furniture back. Now organize behind stereos, nightstands, and workbenches, or safely reroute power away from sinks with ease. Bulky power strips cost as much as $100, and they don't even swivel cords to the side. Call right now to get the Side Socket for just $10. If it ever cracks, breaks, or damages, even if it's your fault, we'll replace it. But hold everything. To make this the most electrifying deal on TV, we're going to include another Side Socket free. Just pay separate processing and handling. That's 2 Side Sockets and the lifetime warranty, all for the low price of just $10. Here's how to get yours.
To order Side Socket for $10 plus processing and handling, call 1-800-562-4299. That's 1-800-562-4299. Or order online at sidesocket.com. Call or log on now.
10 years is a long time. 100,000 miles is a long way. So choose the right car, the Elantra. It carries Hyundai Assurance with America's best warranty. 10 years, 100,000 miles. Test drive the Elantra during the 100,000 Reasons event. Learn why the Elantra holds its value better than any car in its class, according to ALG. You'll also get 0% APR financing for up to 60 months, only at your local Hyundai dealer.
Over the last year that we've been bringing you This Week in Voter Suppression, we've covered some pretty egregious attempts to deny Americans the right to vote. But this week, we are witnessing the passage of a bill that by far eclipses all of the restrictive voting laws that have come before it. The bill passed in North Carolina on Thursday night and is what my guest Ari Berman calls the country's worst voter suppression law. The bill started off badly enough, a strict voter ID measure that could leave 318,000 North Carolinians without the right to vote or without the capacity to vote. But then it ballooned into a, yes, my friends, 57-page voter suppression super bill as Republicans tacked on dozens of amendments to gut voting rights in the state, including the end of same-day voter registration, cutting back early voting, banning paid voter registration drives, repealing a mandate for high school registration drives, eliminating straight party ticket voting, a repeal of out-of-precinct voting, and those are just a few. Ari, I want to go to you on this because the most horrifying ones to me are the ones that actually give the ability of folks, of ordinary citizens, to challenge other citizens' right to vote. It's very sort of 1932. Can you talk to me about that one version?
Sure. So remember that vigilante poll watcher group, True the Vote, in the last election cycle? It's basically like they wrote this entire bill. I mean, there's so many bad elements that were tacked on to the headline elements. So, right, the things we know about the bill is voter ID, cutbacks in early voting, elimination of same-day registration. Those were kind of the headlines. But then there's all these other provisions, like the fact that you can challenge an eligible voter anywhere just because of some suspicion, which really is going to lead, I think, to racial profiling at the polls, on top of everything else. And then there's all these other provisions, for example, getting rid of public financing of judicial elections, getting rid of pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, flooding the system with more unregulated money. Candidates don't have to say who pays for their ads anymore. There's more outside money. So this is really the more money, less voting bill, which is the exact opposite of what our democracy needs right now.
Is North Carolina next? So we saw the Attorney General say we're going to Texas. Is he heading to the Tar Heel State next?
I mean, I'm not sure where the Department of Justice is going next, but someone's going to the Tar Heel state next, as you say. What really has me concerned, I mean, it's a horrible bill all around. But 2.5 million North Carolina voters in 2012 used the early voting period. That's more than half of the voters there, right? And now they want to do exactly what Florida did before the 2012 election, which is lop off 1 week of early voting. Well, we saw what happened in Florida when that happened. You have people casting their ballots after the president had already given his acceptance speech, right? 800,000 of those voters were African American, by the way. Huge disproportionate impact on African American voters.
And in North Carolina, that could be the difference in the next election.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, it's absolutely a swing state. You know what irks me so much about all this, though, is that the kernel, the rationale behind this is such a bad faith argument. Right? The idea that there is an epidemic of voter impersonation. In North Carolina in the last 10 years, there were 0 cases of voter impersonation. In Texas, where the Attorney General went on a fishing expedition to find voter impersonation, amongst the hundreds of millions of votes cast in the last decade, there were 2 convictions on actual voter impersonation. So there is no way you look at the record and say that this legislation is what should come out of these incredibly rare instances.
And Richard, if there was a rash of voter impersonation, let's say there is. Why would ending early voting fix it? In fact, if anything, I would suspect that ending early voting would cause more of it because people are just showing up on that day. I mean, like even the things that they propose to so-called fix this non-existent problem wouldn't be fixes for it.
And also, you know, on the bad faith level, they're not these other bills that are going forward, right, to like, let's make sure everyone has an ID and it's really accessible and we're going to, like, you know, like it is just such a bad faith argument, and that's just really upsetting to see on a just integrity level.
So, Elton, as bad as the bad faith and as sort of distressing as the, you know, super bill is, the one great thing is that Moral Mondays, led by Reverend Barber, the NAACP, a coalition of groups around women's rights, LGBT rights, incarceration, all of that. I think that this Moral Mondays movement is the most exciting thing happening in the country in terms of people pushing back. Is there something we can learn from that? Because undoubtedly, this stuff is going to spread. This doesn't happen in one state. This is going to be in 30 states. How do we make sure there's a Moral Monday in 30 states as well?
Well, what we learn already is that Moral Monday is having an impact. We see the Dream Defenders movement taking place in Florida. We see that clergy are beginning and churches are beginning to join forces with those college students there. We're beginning to recognize that the Marriage Equality Act and movement that is taking place around the country has more and more churches and clergy, African American, people of color, who understand that how one group is affected disproportionately and negatively impacts us all in a bad way.
And on the politics of it, in this purple state, where you have on the one hand people pushing back, you clearly have a movement, and yet my anxiety is there a Democratic Party in operation in the state of North Carolina that could take advantage? Right, so you have this grassroots movement, but then if the parties themselves are so dysfunctional at the state level, how do we then also just do the very basic sort of party building?
Well, this is a bit of a gamble, isn't it, by the supporters of these new restrictions, right? So we saw what happened last time when these sorts of rules changes were pushed, and these sorts of, it was a big source of motivation to Democratic voters. So it ended up having unintentional consequences. You actually saw the African-American turnout rise, which it had a bit of a boomerang effect. This time around, it's a little different. We're looking ahead to the midterm elections. Everyone knows the midterm electorate is generally older, it's whiter, it's more conservative. And so the gamble is that that sort of motivating factor, it'll be a bit muted at the polls next time around. And then, of course, if those laws are in place and left in place, they're there for the 2016 cycle, and that's what the real goal is.
And we know that there's no President Obama on that 2016, right? So we know we'll get a decline in the midterms, no President Obama running for re-election at the top. We got to find where that motivational source is, and that's part of what's interesting about Reverend Barber's movement, is this idea that it's about our democracy. Ari Berman, as always, thank you so much for all of your reporting. You know we're going to keep our eyes on you and what you're up to, and you know the work that you are doing down there in Texas and in North Carolina. Dale Ho, thank you so much for joining us and for the work that ACLU and others are going to have to do now that there's no Section 4. Coming up a little later, renowned life coach Ilyana Van Zant comes to Nerdland.